Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast. And on today's show, we have another returning guest. We spoke together about a year ago now, and in that podcast, we spoke about Karl Popper's social turn in science, and I'm going to link that below. But for today's podcast, we're going to speak about Jacques Barzun. This is Rafe's Champion. Rafe, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be back, Jed.
My pleasure. So I sent you an email a few weeks ago asking if you'd like to come back on. And in that email, I asked if there's anything you would like to talk about rather than me fishing around for a topic. And you said straight away, Jacques Barzun. So why him? I guess that's the first question before we get into who he is and the deeper parts of his work and his philosophy and his work on history. But why is he so important?
Well, I found his book in the college library when I was an undergraduate in agricultural science. It was called The House of Intellect. And it was an absolutely intriguing account of the way intellectual life was being degraded and run down by essentially intellectuals, or people who should have been intellectuals, educated people, university-educated people, who was essentially trashing the house of intellect, as Barzun called it.
So let's leaf into his life and begin to open it up. Who exactly was Barzun? Because I'd heard the name before you mentioned it, but I was very unfamiliar, and I'm sure many listeners either won't have heard of him or won't have heard much about him. So who was he?
Well, he was French born in 1907. And he lived for 105 years to 2012. So he saw out the century, and his last published book was probably published around about the year 2000, when he was well into his 90s. So he French-born, moved to the United States, to Columbia University, for his undergraduate studies, and his Columbia University College was his intellectual home for decades until he retired. His scope, his range, his scope, and his depth of cultural studies and history are quite remarkable, particularly as he carried a heavy teaching load. He never gave up face-to-face teaching, and he eventually moved into college administration as the provost of the humanities or something of that nature. So no man alive ever saw as many aspects of the intellectual or university world as him.
And he seemed to have, we will get into it again, but he seemed to have pre-echoed many of the problems that seem to be ramping up in today's universities.
Well, he was following them step by step as they emerged in the post-war period, when the universities grew like mushrooms, which was the root of the problem, that they grew faster than the tradition. There just weren't enough scholarly teachers to provide the kind of mentorship and the personal contact with the hordes of students that poured in. So instead of students stopped having any personal relationship with their teachers. They sat in classes of hundreds, and they just never got any personal sense of being engaged in a mutual endeavour with their teachers in the way that they might have done when the classes were small and they could have a certain amount of face-to-face contact and conversation.
The context here matters too. I dug up a little bit in preparation for this podcast, listening to the few bits of Barzun's interviews that are there online. And in at least two of them, he mentions that even though it was the 1930s when he first went to Columbia, or just before that, and it was the growing early stages of Cold War in some ways, all his colleagues, Trillin and people like this, they were communists or a very left wing, and he didn't fit in at the time, and he never really fit in. His period there runs well into the 1950s and beyond.
Yes, he said reflectively in a late interview that he was friendly enough as a colleague with people like Trilling. They shared a teaching load, and they were friends out of college, and they tolerated his non-leftism simply because they would have liked him as a person, and they couldn't really understand why he wasn't one of them ideologically. So that's a very sad commentary on the way intellectuals of that period did go to the left.
And so his first book, I think his first book is his doctoral dissertation. His second book is called Race, A Study in Modern Superstition. And this is the kind of book you imagine would get people raring in the 1930s from perhaps a different direction. And if it was published today, would have people furious from a completely different direction. But he begins looking into race through a particular lens. And this is from pre-revolutionary France.
That's so intriguing. Yeah, I'm at a loss. But I just find that remarkable that you're quite right. His first book was his dissertation essentially, but then he went up to the more general level of racism in the next book after that. I think his scholarship was just a bit too deep for me. I came to those books on race late in my journey through Barzun's work. The books, the sequence I read the books would have been The House of Intellect, and then a book about science, which he called Science to Glorious Entertainment, which I was intrigued a bit in that because I was a practicing scientist at the time. Then he wrote probably a book about the university, where the universities had gone wrong, but that was 1968 that was published. I probably should have read his books in order, but in fact I read them in funny orders. And so it was only when I wrote that essay to summarise his career that I got any sense of the common threads that ran through his work. Prior to that, I was mainly concerned in his work on education and what was going wrong in the universities when I was there, getting the backwash of what he discovered in the United States a few decades earlier.
Let's talk about that, some of that early work then, and that. So he coins the phrase race thinking. He has an idea early on. I think it's in his dissertation, in fact, that a lot of the dispute over what was happening in France, in pre-revolutionary France, was about race, and he held on to the fact that, in fact, race thinking and this idea persisted well after the revolution. It was simply passed on. So from nobility versus the bourgeois to something along the lines of it's now implanted in ideas we have about nations and political parties and religious faiths and things like this. So I might yet open up that idea that that even back then in France, as things move forward, this idea of race thinking, because this is going to become an important thread here, it just never seems to disappear. It always seems to morph into something else.
Oh, I think that's a really profound and important insight. That's just so important and so profound. I think I didn't find the time to follow the intricacies of his scholarship on the pre-revolutionary French situation. But when I came to read in fact, it was a reprint of his book on racism, reprinted in 1966. It was reprinted just after the race relations legislation was passed in 1965, which institutionalised affirmative action, which he railed against in the preface to his book, which was published the following year. So, but I thought, I've always regarded affirmative action as racist, just straight up racism. And he put that out in his book about race. You don't fight racism with racism. You just have to, you don't go down that track, but they did, and it's been a catastrophe. He said, you do that, you merely perpetuate race thinking. And I really appreciated a few sentences he wrote where he referred to Marxism, where the inferior, in this case, the inferior class, rather than, is regarded as essentially subhuman or vermin, that they have no dignity, no rights hardly to exist. So that's the tragedy of Marxism and every other ism which has adopted what he called race thinking. It poisons their relations, it poisons policy, and we haven't been able to get away from it because affirmative action became institutionalised in legislation, and because it doesn't solve the problem that it's supposed to solve, typically the advocates just want to do more of it rather than going back and thinking, well, maybe we got it wrong and we shouldn't have done it this way. Instead of making that admission, they just try and make it even tougher and more discriminatory. Just like a vicious, really vicious and destructive cycle. And I guess that just came through so much in the Black Lives Matter thing that went around the world. That was just the triumph of race thinking, with the hatred directed at the whites in the most rancid, disgusting and dehumanising ways, where school children of white would be required to more or less confess their sins and be educated in how horrible they were. This is almost hardly the words to describe how disgusting it is.
I am aware that Barzun headed some of these issues off, but I think we should talk about that affirmative action here. Why do you think it is such an attractive idea? Because I mean, Barzun's talking about America, of course, but this is a kind of policy that exists in many different countries around the world. Why do you think it is such an attractive policy? So clearly, when the gears get moving on it, it is very hard to backtrack on. It seems to grow and grow. But as a first principle, why do you think it is such an attractive idea?
Well, Thomas Sowell wrote a really good book that I had the good fortune to read and review when it was hot off the press. He described the experience of affirmative action in worldwide, in a wide range of countries. And he said typically the Sri Lanka or Ceylon was an archetypal case where he said for generations the Tamils and the others had coexisted, living in the same country with different cultural customs. Their elites went to the same universities and drank in the same pubs, and until a Bandaranaike turned up and decided to racialise the situation. And decided that the Tamils were doing too well. They had a culture of education and entrepreneurship, and he decided this was unfair. They owned too much and they got too many top jobs. And so it went from there and ended up as a civil war. But the point, Sowell's point, was that typically the people who start these programs rolling are well-placed members of that group who've done perfectly well themselves in the system, but taking up this cause gives them a chance to appeal, get political power, influence. Essentially, they get power. They get the power political office, the power. They get to feel good, and tragically, it doesn't really work out for their followers, because in Malaya, there was a study that showed that after the racial discrimination policies were put in place, so many of the entrepreneurs, the people who created wealth and work, were ethnic Chinese, so they got pushed aside, and the businesses were taken over by the Malaysian ethnics, and they didn't actually prosper, and the people were actually worse off as a result of pushing aside the ethnic Chinese. They were worse off than they were before. One of their leaders even conceded that, but he said, well, the workers prefer to be exploited by their own race. It's just the most miserable excuse for an admission of failure, that this program that was supposed to advance the downtrodden race, it advanced those who got to be employed in the higher positions where the Chinese have been pushed out, but it did nothing. It was detrimental for the mere workers who depended on basically the prosperity of the country to lift their boats. So and it's the same in Australia. The people who are agitating right now for a thing we call the Voice, that's an Aboriginal voice to Parliament, they're all very well off. They're practically an elite. And out in the bush, there's the most appalling atrocities being committed within the Aboriginal community. But these people in the city who want this voice, they've never lifted a finger to do something practical or concrete about the misery and suffering of their colleagues out in the bush. Blatant careerism and power seeking. Blatant.
So if I'm following Sol on this, I guess one of the most significant problems, just to clarify that with affirmative action, is that it always tends to focus around, in those examples you gave me there, of significant job placement, also university applications. And these are tricky things to get through at the best of times, and much trickier if you're coming from a low socioeconomic background.
Well, what's happened in Australia, and what's happened in the United States, that because they've let people in who weren't really qualified to enter by objectives or the previous standards that would have been applied. So they have to either be allowed in without meeting the standard, or they have to get in at the expense of other. But when they let people in that don't have the appropriate standards, then there's huge pressure not to fail them. They went there to get passed through the system. And so there's been a massive, what they call it, grade inflation to push the grades up so these people don't fail. So the value of the qualification has become really suspect, to a point where employers are now using their own tests to work out whether the graduates actually know anything before they start.
I'm just, of course, I'm about to say this, both of them are race thinking, so I'm sure Barzun would be against them both. But I'm assuming he might be more sympathetic towards a grassroots affirmative action that focuses on the grassroots economic issues that exist at the very bottom, rather than insisting that a certain number of people need to be in certain jobs or in certain places.
100%. My challenge to say people who promote affirmative action, I say to them, look, you find a deprived, this applies to affirmative action for poor, low-class people. If you guys want them to advance, well, go out, find a disadvantaged school, start going to the P&C, get to know the teachers, get to know the school, and then get to know some of the students and become a coach and helper of the students. Like, don't expect that just pouring more money into a big bin at the top of the education system and hope that some of it trickles down and does some good in this depressed school. Get out there and find what kids need. Like, this kid probably needs a reading lamp, and this other kid needs some coaching with his maths, and this one has to have his parents have to be encouraged to supervise his homework. You get out and actually help students at school to meet the standards, to actually learn and grow to a point where they can get into university on their own merits. But get in early and do what needs to be done on the spot, and not just push them up later on and say, "Oh, God, we've got to get some percentage of these in." God. Now, that's going to be slow. It's going to be difficult, but it's going to be worthwhile, because you'll end up lifting them to it. Well, you just lift them to a standard, and they won't have to be embarrassed or given fake grades when they actually do get through to uni.
So there is an argument out there, and as I'm saying this, I'm looking at a quote from Barzun, which he's trying to counter this as well. But there's an argument, and it's incredibly pervasive in Australia and America and many other countries around the world, and that is, if there's going to be an existing so just imagine a country where there is an existing racial prejudice that happened for many years. And said, if that is going to exist, then why shouldn't that maligned, that marginalized, that class that paid a price for that, why shouldn't they benefit in reverse? That seems to be a very attractive idea for many people.
Well, it's an attractive idea for the people who are going to get an advantage out of it, and the people who feel good by promoting that position. But the problem there is that the people who, let's say, mistreated and abused 50, 60, 70 or 100 or 150 years ago, they're long gone. The people who did the damage have gone. The Aborigines living nowadays, certainly in the last 2 or 3 decades, have enjoyed nothing like the travails of their forebears. Like in the 60s, I think there's an emerging middle class. I mean, they were making their way and rising slowly off a low base. But the thing was that if you're going to advantage these people who hadn't been treated that badly at all, and the people who are going to suffer were current white people who never did anything wrong necessarily at all. So you have people who haven't been badly treated getting benefits off people who weren't part of never treated them badly, because the extent of face-to-face racism has, of course, declined significantly in our lifetimes. Just simply with the growth of kind of education. And
there's a point in this where we talk about affirmative action and this race thinking, and this is one of the I'll get you to talk about this, because this is one of the most important things that Barzun talks about. And of course, this was very forward thinking for his time, and he talks about a type of victim glorification, or a type of righteousness that gets embodied there. And this is a quote from him. He goes on to say, "There are no positive or negative traits that are attached to race or related to it." And that sounds simple, but what he's trying to say is that people have a tendency, when they discover someone who has been victimized, to attach positive traits to that person, and simply because of their race. And this, for Barzun, is going to set off a chain reaction somewhere down the line, where you're continuously looking at races of people and applying blanket statements about who they are and what their values are, not thinking about the individuals involved in the complexities. He also, he talks in his time, and you wrote about this, he talks about attempts while he was alive in his early years, of people trying to ban The Merchant of Venice and have Huckleberry Finn removed from shelves. And you go on to say that, of course, he would, if he was alive today, he'd be looking at the removal of Confederate statues and politicians in this way. So I might get to open up why you think these two are connected, and because for many people, and this, I'll give you I'll give you the I don't know if it's a straw man or a steel man argument, but I'll do my best here. They will say they're different. Of course, Huckleberry Finn isn't that bad, but a Confederate statue is a horrible memory of racism in America.
Well, unfortunately, that pitchforks into the whole argument about the cause and purpose of the Civil War. There's a case to be made that the states simply wanted to secede for various reasons, and slavery was only a minor part of it. But the point is that why rewrite history? I mean, okay, there was a war, there were heroes on both sides. Why would you want to tear down? Well, why would you want to tear anything down? It's just a part of a historical record. It's just a really small-minded thing to do, and it serves no useful purpose that I can see.
Barzun would say, I'm assuming that it would serve a negative purpose of increasing animosity.
So. Yeah, quite so.
So I wonder then, I mean, we're going to continue on with race, but he does talk about social reformers along the way a lot, and the idea of a developing nation. And this goes into the question of race, which is heavy in his work. But he says that in some ways we are always on the lookout for people who are, and his quote is, we're always searching for people who are left out in society. Everywhere you look, in every institution, armies, colleges, hospitals, restaurants, we're always searching around for people who are left out in some way. And he goes on to say this is somehow we are criticizing ourselves all the way through, of course. But of course, we're always searching for holes and problems and ways to beat ourselves up.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Something that I discovered in the 1960s when I first started reading anthologies of sociology, as I made a transition from agricultural science to sociology, there seemed to be a sudden surge of literature dealing with every kind of deviant behaviour, crime and drug use and this and that. And in each case, the problem was ascribed to a sort of vague entity described as society. It's as though drug addicts were drug addicts because of society, and criminals were criminals because of society. And whereas a more homespun approach would be, well, they're drug addicts because they decided to use drugs. And if they were concerned, if being a bit poor and marginalised was a problem, well, encourage them to get a job and make their way in society more effectively. It's as though any personal weakness or delinquency had to be actually blamed on someone else other than the person's laziness or disorganisation or some personal characteristic. It had to be the fault of society in some way. And so similarly with the lower position of any particular ethnic group, it's society's fault. It's not, and so you have to change society rather than changing little bits of society to help that person get ahead by encouraging them to be more studious or more disciplined or more hardworking or more responsible. Instead you have to change society, not in any particularly helpful or specific way. Like, how would you change society? You might change it by promoting Christian ethics or all the ethics of service and diligence and the things that part of the Christian tradition. You might change society by making people more Christian.
Well, that last moment, that last thing you said about making it more Christian, he has an interesting view on this phenomenon, and he goes back to the Enlightenment, and he said there are two counteracting forces here that come together and cause a massive problem. And I'm going to be quoting you here when I write this. You write, on one hand, Christian moral fervor was secularized, which produced demands for moral perfectibility in society. On the other hand, modern science called into question the reality of moral motives. And he says, and you go on to say that this is an explosive mixture where people are morally indignant all the time, as well as being morally relativist all the time.
Yeah, well, that's an idea I picked up from somebody else, but not from Barzun. I introduced that after he wrote quite a bit about what you were talking about before, how the quest to help people who have been left out. He said this, and of course the problem with people who want to fix things up passionately is when everything, the major thing, has been fixed up, you have to make a fuss about less major things. And the ultimate there is the way that things have gone lately, where women have got their emancipation. That was a big group. That then you had the gay community got their emancipation, but it got to the point where the transsexuals are now, they're like the last minority, and by far the smallest. They're vanishingly small, and yet it's as though the efforts required to help them. Think of all the big firms that are now advertising that they've got what is a queer. They're just going out of their way to say that they are going to help these people. As the words ran, it's the secularization of utopianism, religious utopianism, as though if it's not perfect, it's hopeless. No perspective.
You said the last one, and I'm sure that was a slight misspeaking, but it does open up an idea on Barzun here. And he would, of course, I'm assuming, say, not the last one, just the most current, the latest one, because once you and of course, race thinking, like he said, spreads across a number of factors here. But once you let this idea in that you identify with the group rather than with the individual, and you apply values to downtrodden groups, that the game will become for many people to start searching out in groups that they belong to and thinking of them in terms of groups that they maybe belong to and may be downtrodden and may be left out of society. And this will in fact never end. You could keep searching for a new group.
Yeah, you're quite right. I did misspeak. No, in principle, there's no end to it. It's just a matter of human ingenuity to find another frontier to conquer.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. So one of the things that he talks about is I think he uses the phrase salvation by political action, which I think is quite good. Of course, he's not impressed by it, but he says it's one of the great myths of the 20th century. And he goes on to say why people are just simply expecting much too much from politics, and that the real way that we move forward and we protect our rights and we gain more rights that we might like is through, but his quote is decency and self-restraint and culture.
Yeah, and he said elsewhere wrote we should approach these issues as artisans rather than partisans, as though we approach a problem in the sense of, well, how does this problem get fixed, rather than assuming that one side or the other of politics has got the answer, and then you side with that side and make the other lot the enemy. And it's very much a matter of approaching a problem with an open mind about what might be done about it, as though the first thing you think of, which might be affirmative action or massive expenditure of money, those two things may not be the solution to the problem at all when you think through the steps about implementation and the consequences, and particularly the incentives incentives that you create. So if there's affirmative action in play, what's the incentive for a particular student or other to do better and get better marks if they know they're going to get in anyway? And if you know that there's bountiful welfare available, if you know how to work, well, why would you bother to work?
One of the things he said was people, this is me paraphrasing him badly here, so please correct me if I get this wrong, but people tend to support political parties. I think this is similar to what you said earlier, for that reason that they get to in some way blind their judgment a little bit, and they don't have to think so much about the particulars that are underlying what they're looking at. So you can, as you mentioned earlier, the new legislation that people are going to vote on in Australia soon, the voice to parliament, people get to galvanize behind this thing, either for or against it. And Barzun was saying this is an excuse for many people to not think enough about the small particulars and the small on-the-ground changes, or perhaps what Popper would have called the small piecemeal engineering changes that are required within society.
Precisely. It sort of comes together in a bundle where, just taking the voice. For a start, the voice is being pushed by elites. They've hitherto shown no interest at all in being a voice for their disadvantaged brethren in the outback. So it can only be seen as an attempt to get more power and influence for themselves and possibly collateral benefits for their brethren, but in a very strange way, in a sense that the benefits will come without the kind of efforts that's required to get things like working steadily and progressing in that way. Is those things are supposed to fall in your lap by the way of reparations that they want to get.
I did go searching for criticisms of Barzun, and one of them that kept popping up, and I'm generally interested here in how you view this, because I can see the sense of it in his writing, but in some sense, it doesn't seem to work for me. But the criticism was that he was an elitist of a kind, that he had this grand romanticized view of the past, and he lived in ivory towers and things like this. But at one point, I think it was you that wrote this. He took his sabbatical leave and he drove across the nation, just simply to write a book, which he ended up calling The Teacher in America. And he has this quote which says, I might read it in whole actually. It says, "Whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America better learn baseball, the rules and realities of the game, and to do it by watching first some high school or small town teams." So what do you make of that argument against him, that criticism that he was an elitist of a kind?
Well, he was an elite scholar, obviously I presume a brilliant teacher and effective administrator, so he was an elitist. But in terms of the negative, there's nothing negative about that any more than there's anything negative about being an elite sports player. I don't see the downside of it. I mean, he didn't have anything remotely resembling contempt towards the lower, what you might call the lower orders. As you can see from his thing about how do you learn baseball, learn at the ground roots, get right to the bottom and see what it's like. I'm pleased that you did look for criticism, because I've never made a systematic attempt. In fact, I've never seen much in the way of. Well, in fact, I've never seen much said about Barzun at all. This is what exasperates me. Like all of the people in Australia that I know who know about him, they know about it because I've told them. He's never talked about. It's like as though he doesn't exist. And so we'd love to see some criticism, just to see how he looks to other people who don't have the same admiration that I do. Where is the criticism?
Well, let me try and turn that criticism on the lathe and send it in from another angle. Perhaps the criticism is something like this, which is and maybe this is I didn't get to a point where Barzun started thinking about epistemology, but this might be a bit of a Popperian criticism. Again, I'm not sure how well it applies though, and it might be that he thinks America's degraded in some way or it's declined, when in fact, we've never had it so good. Science has never had it so good. We've maximized individualism, which produces chaos and problems and criticism and foolishness and mistakes. But that's part of I guess that's part of progress in a way. And maybe so I remember reading at least some of the criticism was that he couldn't see the forest for the trees, maybe.
Yeah, I'd need to see. I need to see a bit more specific kind of detail. I mean, as far as American education is concerned, it's just a terrible mess. I mean, he got it. It just went backwards in his lifetime. So, more people went to university, but then we have so many dud. And it doesn't mean just sending a lot of people to university produces good results.
Well, what are those difficulties in the education system then? Let's move into that. You at the beginning you spoke about not teacher in America, but I forget what the book's name.
The university, about where the American university, where it's going, what it's doing, or where it's going to affect.
And you spoke about the house of the intellect, and what was his most so apart from America's high school system and school system falling apart and too many students being pushed into university degrees, what were his criticisms of the system? At one point he says, and again, this part did strike me as a little bit off, but I'm assuming it's simply a misusing of the word fun. He says one of the problems on the fads in American system is that we want education to be fun. And I'm assuming the problem he has in his mind there is probably thinking of fun in terms of playful and light rather than rigorous and hard work and enjoyable, enjoying the process of struggling, failing and repeating.
Well, actually, I've mucked it up again because that was my paraphrase. I was the one who put fun in, and I don't know why I did actually. It's like, but I think I do know why. It's because a certain amount of discipline is required to master some of the basics. The fun comes when you've mastered them, and then you can play around. But you do need to get basic material on board, like your times tables, for example. There's a teacher in England who started a new school where everything is done very much by the old-fashioned book, where students sit up straight in class with their arms straight out in front of them, paying attention to the teacher, and they don't lean, roll, wriggle, and loll around and play with their phones in class. Now, and the teaching profession in large part hates her with like poison. But one of the things is that the kids in that school end up loving to learn. They put in the effort and they get the benefit and they love it. So the fun comes after you've done the hard work, I guess. The other thing she did, she abandoned this thing of having the desks all in a circle or little work teams of people working together, as though you learn by playing in a group. No, she got away. She just went right back to the original structure of the classroom, and people learned. These disadvantaged kids came out and got into the best schools around because they actually learned stuff instead of having. And Barzun was onto this. Children in primary school would be given projects like research projects, which were just plain crazy. Like, and they might go home and cut things out of a newspaper as a study in some contemporary social issue. instead of just learning some American history or geography or something. They were doing these fun projects, but they weren't learning anything. So that was my gloss, was saying it was too much fun. But on a more serious note, another concern he had was the way PhD studies had gone. He called it the PhD octopus. And that was a serious matter. But I won't go down that track unless you do want to talk about what was going wrong with PhDs. But that was in the same sentence or paragraph that I wrote about things that were going wrong.
You mentioned there that the expanded scope of the school, and I like you to open that up a little bit more, because one of the things that Barzun is really on about here isn't just that he doesn't like the structure of the classrooms anymore. But he's saying that even if that schools have basically, I think he used the word, it's a form of colonialism, where the schools are reaching beyond themselves and the governments are reaching into the schools beyond themselves, where schools have decided that part of what they have to teach is personal development, citizenship studies, social ability, and things like this. And they've simply, I listened to an interview of his, and he said, if they advertised that and said, this is what we're teaching at the school, then he wouldn't have a big problem with it. But it's been smuggled in under general education.
Yes, well, I'm hearing lately that so many odd things have been smuggled in that the teachers who are really concerned about teaching are just feeling swamped. Because now, of course, there's all this stuff about recanting our racist thought crimes and learning about what it means to have diversity and equity. This sort of thing, this is coming on top of the old-fashioned thing about sociability, and I think it might have been driving skills at one point. And then, of course, there's the whole thing about sex education. That was supposed to do something to correct teenage pregnancy. So they brought in sex education programs, and it didn't make any difference. So they thought, we better start younger. So they kept pushing down sex education until it's got practically to kindergarten, where it's just totally inappropriate. And in fact, now that's morphed into gender bending. But
how much of this is the impact of corporations and foundations? At some point, he said one of the biggest problems this is special interests trying to get involved in the classroom rather than leaving the classrooms to themselves.
I thought the thing about the corporations was mainly that at the university level. His thing about colonising the universities is that you had foundations who decided they wanted to improve the world by giving grants to university staff to go and study stuff like in third world countries. So they'd get a grant to go off and study something or other in Venezuela. And that was the idea, was to do exciting projects about exciting problems in exciting places, rather than taking on more serious research that was actually related to their proper academic interests. So as though the temptations coming in from the corporate or philanthropic world were too good to resist, but they did not contribute to a strong research tradition in the school, which became, in a sense, colonised by out. The other thing they did, they didn't put enough extra money in for overheads, so, and also tended to give the grants for a limited period, and the people who got them wanted to stay on in perpetuity. So that was about the corporate and philanthropic impact on the universities. And I think the other thing about outreach from the universities was that they were supposed to get involved in things like poverty reduction programs in the district, as though the university became a miscellaneous all-purpose problem-solving instrument. So you could switch it on to poverty reduction in their surrounding suburbs, or you could switch it on to fix something in Venezuela or the Appalachians. But all of this done quickly, because that had to be done very quickly and effectively, without taking account of the time it takes to do good, solid, helpful research to actually say you understand the problem, rather than just going in and having a look around and then writing a paper.
And this nullification of a kind, I found one of the most interesting things that he said, of course, looking at America from a distance here, was looking in and looking at that tour he did around America when he was writing about the places he went and the people he spoke to. And one of his great laments was nothing serious was ever spoken about, that we could talk about how bad the world was in certain areas and how bad things were, and we wanted to improve things within society. But basically, you couldn't have a serious discussion with someone. And this is the idea that there's a famous phrase, no religion or politics around the dining table. And he just kept encountering this everywhere he went, and he kept wanting to speak about serious issues, and no one, it was considered impolite to have a serious conversation.
Oh, I thought that was one of the most interesting things that he wrote. And I could see, and the way I described it, which I think was probably, I said, the moment that a hint of a cerebral conversation or a hint of a divisive issue looms up, then there's a quick retreat or a quick defensive reaction to diffuse the situation, as though he said, as though there's no way they haven't cultivated a tradition of a civilized discussion about, for argument's sake, cerebral things, or a civilized discussion about fairly serious differences. I've found in one-on-one conversations with people of the left that you can make some progress one-on-one, but you never make progress where there's a group. You run into group solidarity. So that, but getting back to Barzun's point, I take it it's as though there's an embarrassment or an awkwardness. It's one of the funny things that's happening in recent years here. I've started a Friday morning coffee club for basically conservatives, elderly, middle-aged conservatives, and we just have a really fun discussion about a whole heap of serious issues. And every few weeks, someone at an adjacent table overhears what we're talking about, and they come up and say, "Oh my God, I've never heard any conversation like this before." But they say it with a certain amount of respect and admiration, as though it doesn't seem like a bad thing. It's happened quite a few times, and it's quite interesting.
There's well, I was just going to say, you do talk to some people of the left. I think I'm of the left. I think so. Instead of getting into what that means these days, I think I'm of the left these days, and we talk reasonably well enough across interviews and emails as well. But there was another point, and I think this is a very good Popperian point. And as you wrote this in your article, you must have been thinking of echoes of Popper about this. And I might read the quote, and this is Barzun in that book, Teacher in America. If science students leave college thinking, as they usually do, that science offers a full, accurate, and literal description of man in nature, if they think their theories spring from facts and that scientific authority at any time is infallible, and if they think that science steadily and automatically makes for a better world, then they have wasted their time in the science lecture room, and they are a plain menace to the society in which they live.
Yeah, well, that's pretty well straight Popperian. But the one thing that intrigues me is that there's no evidence that Popper ever read Barzun, and there's a very small footnote reference in Barzun to the logic of scientific discovery, just a little footnote in passing. And I think that what a strange thing. I admire them probably more than any other two people, and yet they're like ships that passed in the night. And I'm just, if I had the chance, if they were alive, I'd want to say to them, to Popper, well, did you never hear about Barzun? Or what if you read this little essay I wrote about him and tell me what you think? Too late now, of course. But there's no doubt that they were at one regarding the mechanics or the ethics or whatever you like of scholarship and learning, that it's conjectural, no one's an ultimate authority. You have to be careful about applying your knowledge. All of that is just straight, you might say it's common sense, except there's not enough of it about. And you get that in both Popper and Barzun, as you say.
What you mentioned at the very beginning of this, that Barzun was a very happy teacher. He was one of those rare university professors that liked to teach. And I say that in with a smile on my face, because you mentioned this, and anyone that's been to a university will know that many of the professors, not all, but many of them have a certain loathing for their time they have to spend in the classroom, and they wish they could simply be in an office somewhere doing research or publishing articles or whatever they may want to do. It's not to teach. And this is one of the things that Barzun rails against. And he says these professors are bringing things on themselves, where in one hand they tell students that the world out there is doomed. Of course, as I mentioned, this is a Cold War period, and many professors in America, were very, very socialist or even openly communist. And he says in one sense they say to the world that it is doomed, and in the other sense they're completely disinterested in teaching or being in the classroom. And he said this combination in some ways brought about a lot of those university protests and, very severe university protests at the time. Campuses were burnt down.
Yeah, that's an intriguing period of history. But I was almost on the streets myself, like in a quiet, peaceful way, at campus protests and protests off campus. I'm not sure we ever got to burning things down in Australia, but anyway, it's mind you, what he wrote about what was going on in the universities about what he called the flight from teaching or something. I never experienced that because we didn't have that phenomenon in at least the Tasmania University where I went to, that we did have continuity of teachers. They didn't go flitting off, and they were available generally if you wanted to approach them, because they didn't have massive classes, because it was only a small university. So my experience was almost like a golden age compared with most that I've read and seen and even experienced in subsequent decades. This was a campus with less than 2,000 students. It's like, that's probably, nowadays the average is probably 220,000 or more.
He also pre-echoed the growing administration of universities, which of course many people will see. It gets a lot of criticism these days about the huge size of the administration, the burden it has, and then the overreach it tends to have into the lives of students and professors. And he was very early on talking about this growing sector of the university and the problems it was going to cause.
Yeah, well, I think that was some of his best in the sense that he got to the problem, but it's only got worse since then. So it's not as though his identification of the problem helped. I mean, you'd say he must have thought his life was wasted in ways that he saw so much that was wrong and it only just kept getting worse.
He did teach a wonderful class, though, that you mentioned, and this is with Lionel Trillin, and he calls it the Great Books Program at Columbia. And Lionel Trillin, I'm not sure how close of friends they were, but they were very close colleagues, at least.
And they were friends off campus. This is the thing that made me so bitterly disappointed when there was a collection of essays about or dedicated to Barzun late in his life, the Festschrift type of thing. Trilling was supposed to write a biographical chapter because he knew Barzun personally, like their families would have spent time together. But he contracted something like pancreatic cancer, which can kill people very quickly. And he never got past notes for that chapter. And I'm just totally mortified, as I wrote, that it would have been such a thing to get a pen picture of this man, as I described it, unbuttoned away from the classroom, relaxed in a social context. We might have got some hint about the demons that drove him to read and write so much. We might have got that from a fairly close friend like Trilling. But there's nothing. I mean, I don't see much criticism of him, or much discussion of him. Obviously, in the United States, there's a lot more because there was a big article in some magazine or other, and you've found some of those things. You found interviews.
So not many though.
Than I have seen.
Mm.
But as I also wrote, that just collecting a whole list of everything he wrote, including things he wrote with pseudonyms as a student, writing detective stories and film and play reviews and this and that, that'd be a monstrous labour in itself, just to compile a bibliography of all of his writing.
On that, art. So he writes a lot about music and he writes about art as well. And his work on art, it's fantastic. I managed to find a few books of his. But when he writes about art, he takes a lot of the criticism he has about the university sector and society at large and brings it into the arts. And he goes on to say, very important things such as he looks at the modern art movement, which he's not entirely negative about. He says it has some value, but he says it's almost its entire value is in how much it can confront or deliberately attack the sensibilities. And that has taken on almost like a religious tone, of course. Once it has done that, then it becomes a great piece of art. And lost at the wayside are, ideas of beauty and romanticism and classicism and all these other things that you may want. So I might yet open up his approach to art and those criticisms he has of a world flooded by too much art. At some point, he said, is just a glut of it out there in the world.
Yeah. So you had the most amusing essay about too much art. Well, one of the books which I've got on my shelf, it's called The Energies of Art, and I'll just pull it down. It's not a book which I've really read properly from cover to cover. I think it's a collection of essays. And it's supposed to have his positive contribution to the art, like what's good about aspects of art, whereas the thinner book, The Use and Abuse of Art, is where he looks at different pathological developments that you've hinted at, which I think is a deadly attack pretty well. But his positive side is supposed to be in this collection. And of course, the other thing is, which is I might have mentioned in the biographical section, he grew up in a house where his father held what they call a weekly or regular salon. And the salon is where poets and avant-garde people of all kinds, writers, poets, whatever, would just come around and spend the afternoon having a great talk. And he met some of the leading artists and writers of the age, like as a child. One of them painted his portrait, and one of them taught him how to tell the time with his watch. He would have sat on their knees when he was young. So he was soaked in the avant-garde. And he said some of the old guys would come around occasionally just to see what the young ones were up to. He was just soaked in the ambience of avant-gardism up to immediately preceding World War One. Born in 1907, he was he was only 7 when the war started, dear me. So and then it would have disrupted everything. But so up to the age of 7, he was a child of the avant-garde, as I say, sitting on their knees, listening to them, watching them. And there you go. And he later wrote that there was wonderful developments going on, but because so much talent was lost in the war, they had to make a kind of new start afterwards without the leadership of so many good or great people who died. And so you might say art never recovered.
There's a part in your article where I think you mentioned it. I can't remember whether it was his quote or yours, but I thought it was really important where he said that generation after the war, they had two things running in their minds. One, they didn't have guidance from that older generation, so they weren't being guided. And at one point,
that's what he said. I might have quoted him or I might paraphrase it, but that's it.
But the second half of that is, I think, the most important part. That one, they weren't being guided, and because they didn't have guidance, they didn't have a proper sense of resistance to the elders. They weren't criticizing and resisting the elders either, which was a problem.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, it's a bit like modern progressive or permissive parenting, where the kids don't get any pushback. Like we had one of them, these people came round to our house, and I think the child was banging a glass top table with a piece of wood, and the parents took absolutely no notice, as though it's just okay. So kids just don't get any sense of boundaries, and the same in a way with the artist, that if they're not getting any pushback or at least challenging comment from elders and others, well, they're operating in a vacuum. They have to make everything up by themselves.
One more thing on art before I ask you a couple of last questions here. He has another, and this connects a little bit to our earlier discussions. He talks about the role in life for the revolutionary artist and the role in life of revolutionary art, and he goes on to say that it offers the artist himself or herself a very special role within the society, not just in the vanguard of the change and of the revolutionary change, but as the beneficiary of it as well. So it is an entirely self-interested movement in some ways. The revolutionary artists building a revolution that they will benefit from in the long run.
That's certainly the tone of it. I'm just trying to think how that works out in practice. I suppose if you're on the side of the revolutionaries, you become a state-sponsored artist afterwards, and so you get special treatment and such like. Or it might be that you simply get to be high regard or reputation more than I could sort of see what he was getting at, but I couldn't think of concrete examples very clearly.
Let's talk about his legacy and where he sits. And at the very end of your article, you mention, I must thank you first. I'd heard of the name, but I hadn't been too deep into him, William Bartley. And since you mentioned him, I bought all the books that I could online of him. And one of his books is Unfathomed Knowledge,
Yeah,
Unmeasured
absolutely,
Wealth.
that one.
This is posthumously published, of course, but it's
Yeah,
his great attack on the university system. And I
yeah.
guess, do you see any influence of Barzun in people like Bartley over the years? Was there some lingering impact here? So he's not very well known, and I did find some interviews, but not many. So he's not very well known. You're right, but do you think he has a larger following within specialized areas of academia?
Yeah, is this Bartley or Barzun?
Barzun.
I don't think anybody follows him at all, that I know of. As I said, I've not seen anything written about him by anybody. I saw something about 1973. Someone referred to him, and I can remember that because I haven't seen anything like it since.
Mm.
Quite amazing. But as for Bartley, he I know his thing was that maybe the whole life of learning is being threatened by focusing on examinable knowledge, which of course is totally counterintuitive, as though there's, you know, but when you look at the way the universities have gone, it turns out to be not that far from the truth.
And
But,
as
I'm
you,
sorry, one
yeah,
more
please.
thing, Jed.
Hmm.
I asked Bartley if he did know. Yeah, so Bartley did know about Barzun, or I didn't find out how much, even though I've never actually read in in Bartley, any reference to Barzun. Um, so it's just there somewhere in the background of his reading.
One last potential hope then. Well, I mean, I'm not a reader. I haven't read much Barzun, so I'll have to leave this in your hands as a thought. So I wonder how you might see it like this. Popper moaned a lot about people not reading him either, and I heard one of the good examples for people not talking about Popper anymore. And I'm not sure how true this is. I suspect it might have some truth to it. Is simply because his ideas have become so well adopted. And he is, at least the core of his ideas have become so well adopted that we don't use the reference to the man anymore. And I wonder whether some of the ideas that Barzun brought forward, and he spoke about across 40 odd books, I believe, did become or have become so well understood, even if it wasn't through him. And that is one of the reasons why people don't always use a reference point to him. That he has been, it's the fact that people don't speak about him is a sign of his success in some ways, or at least his intellectual
I
success.
think the point you're making 100%. It applies to a guy called, it applies to Karl Bueller, who I say he's got his ideas got into the woodwork of the subject, and they were just there, it was part of the subject, and you didn't need to say his name. But I don't think that's happened with either Popper or Barzun. I mean, scientists willfully flout Popper's instructions on science, and academics willfully flout what Barzun's saying about most aspects of teaching and scholarship. So it'd be lovely to think, well, the world would be a different place. The world of science and the world of academia would be very different places if it were true that their ideas had been incorporated.
So I might ask you a last question then. And of course, it's about legacy again and how you see him fitting in and the importance of his work. I have this wonderful quote of his that I found not in your article, but in another. And I'm sure this is exactly, sometimes you read someone say something and you think that's exactly how that thing must feel when it eventually comes my way. And his quote is, "Old age is like learning a new profession and not one of your own choosing." And it just seems immediately true. And
Yeah.
so how should we look back on someone's work? Like it must be hard when you look back at someone's work like Popper. You can see a central thrust to it, but Barzun's is so large and so diverse.
Yeah.
How should we understand his legacy, do you think?
Well, I think you've hit the nail so precisely on the head. It's large, it's diverse, and it defies a summary into a theme. It's a real challenge. a biographer who soaked himself in the work might be able to sort out a small number of themes and weave them together into a thread. But nobody's done that yet.
But you have written an article.
Your question stands.
But you have written a very interesting article on it, and I'm not sure where it is online. I'm assuming it is online, Rafe, and available.
No, it's a bit of a scandal. I'm just having someone reconstrue, build a new website, and it'll be online in the new website in a few months.
Will that website have the same address as the old one, or?
No, it'll be a new one, but I'll have to put something in the old one that'll point you to it. If you go to that one, you get pointed to the new one.
Well, I will link the old one in this podcast, and of course, I wait patiently for the next one as well. Rafe Champion, thank you so much for your time. It is always such a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Jed. It's a pleasure for me too, and I'm really, really proud that you take the trouble to spend this much time talking to me.